Hey everyone, welcome back. Let's discuss four of the most effective treatments for SIBO and also some nuances regarding different people have different guts, and therefore these tools may take a slightly different application to help those different people use them as effectively as possible. This is Dr. Michael Ruscio. I am a professor at the University of Bridgeport, a clinician and a clinical researcher, and one of my areas of interest and focus and publication is SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, which is a quite important entity to focus on because anything that can disrupt gut function, and SIBO might affect roughly 30 to 40% of people with digestive symptoms, may also contribute to things like fatigue, brain fog, joint pain, skin issues. Just as a short list, because of the very important impact the gut, specifically the small intestine, exerts on your entire body, partially through nutrient absorption, partially through how the intestine is perhaps one of the main sources of inflammation. Let's start our discussion of these four tools: the low FODMAP diet, probiotics, the elemental diet, and also herbal antimicrobials. And as a backdrop, keep in mind this framing that we've been using at the office, which helps parse the individual from the symptoms. And how I mean that is if we know that there's gut dysfunction that's leading to the bloating, the abdominal pain, maybe the brain fog, the insomnia, then we need to better understand what is it in particular in the gut that we can remedy. Now, in some cases, it is SIBO, but consider a study, a very elegant study by Dr. Satish Rao, gastroenterologist at University of Augusta. It's been on the podcast a few times, where he surveyed people with gastrointestinal symptoms that had no known cause. So they weren't celiac, there wasn't inflammatory bowel disease. He found about 20% had SIBO, about 20% had CFO, fungal overgrowth, and 20% had both. So I'm going to factor that into how we provide guidelines to use these tools. So then the first tool is the low FODMAP diet. By design, by definition, the low FODMAP diet will reduce prebiotics, the substrate that feeds bacteria. Now, you may be saying to yourself, well, don't I want to feed bacteria in my gut? If you've been reading on SIBO for a while, you've probably pieced together that more bacteria, more bacterial feeding isn't always good. A period of bacterial reduction can be quite effective, which is why certain studies have commented that after you get garbage food out of your diet and just make basic changes to food quality, after that, the low FODMAP diet is one of the most effective diets for gastrointestinal symptoms. And this is also, obviously because it's been documented to reduce SIBO. Well, how do we know that? There are some studies that have done SIBO breath tests before and after a low FODMAP diet, and they've demonstrated reductions in gas levels. It shouldn't then be surprising that the low FODMAP diet can also reduce leaky gut and correspondingly can reduce inflammation and histamine. These are all part of the same cascade. When you have a leaky gut, particles get through, that triggers the immune system on the other side. So now we have inflammation. And part of what mediates that inflammatory response via the immune system is this molecule histamine. One other factor here, and I'll share an image of this, comes from Tarek Mazalwi and his group that found a low FODMAP diet can actually repair the lining of the intestines in the sense that it can help improve or correct the number of serotonin cells and other like endocrine cells called enteroendocrine cells or EECs in the lining of the gut. So this might be how people notice they have improved motility when using a low FODMAP diet, is because you're literally having more serotonin cells. And you can see here these black specks that are stained for the serotonin cells appear in the lining of your intestine. As context, we had discussed with Dr. Alex Ford from the University of Leeds a while back a fairly pivotal meta-analysis he published in The Lancet, finding that an antidepressant, a tricyclic antidepressant, amitriptyline, was fairly effective when used in low doses, the non-antidepressant doses, but a low enough dose to impact serotonin levels in the gut. So there might be a more natural dietary based way to get to better serotonin output via better serotonin cell density in the gut. How does this then, the low FODMAP diet, map onto the potential of fungal overgrowth? It's an unknown. To my knowledge, there are no studies at current that have looked at pre-post levels of fungus after a low FODMAP diet. We can make one, I think, logical inference, which is that we know that inflammation is poisonous, so to speak, to a healthy microbiome. So if the low FODMAP diet reduces inflammation, we should then see a healthier microbiota and mycome, fungal levels, if you will. That's inferential, but I think it's very reasonable given the fact that people see so much symptomatic improvement on the low FODMAP diet. So the first tool is a low FODMAP diet. Now, something that we'll hear in the clinic quite often is, I looked up the low FODMAP diet. I saw different lists. I wasn't sure what to do, so I didn't move forward. This is a mistake. Let me tell you why. You will see broad agreement across most of the low FODMAP diets. At least there should be anyway, if you're getting a decently accurate source. There might be some nuances where one diet says you can't have any broccoli, the other says you can have a quarter cup or something like that. And this is because some guidelines, some dietary guides will give you either a black and white, or they'll give you a avoid, consume in moderation, and consume liberally. So that is part of where the confusion comes from. And then also what happens in some applications is people, let's say, of the paleo diet community camp, they may cut out foods that they don't like people to eat that are inflammatory, like gluten, grains, and dairy. And that's really a different diet. That's what we've called the paleo low FODMAP diet, but it's taking two different sets of rules and pulling them together. If you wanted the most direct to the data source, the Monash app would be where to go. We also have a paleo low FODMAP guide, a standard, so unadulterated low FODMAP guide, and then a vegetarian low FODMAP guide, depending on your dietary needs. But that is the first tool. And if it's the right fit for your gut, most people will know inside of a week. Some people, it may take the second week, but usually you at least have a sense that this diet is working by the first to second week. Now, that's different than saying all of your symptoms will be resolved. That may take 2 or 3 months to see sort of the pinnacle level of improvement. But nevertheless, your first evaluation benchmark, first or second week. And by the way, if this has been helpful, please comment and subscribe. I really do appreciate hearing what people think, so I'll look forward to reviewing your comments. So this then brings us to the second tool, probiotics. I would recommend using the probiotics concurrently. There's a couple studies that have found synergistic benefits, so better overall effect, when using these at the same time. And this is what we fairly routinely recommend at the clinic. Probiotics have a number of benefits that they exert. They are antibacterial. There's well over 20 clinical trials demonstrating that probiotics as a standalone treatment can remedy SIBO, which is just wonderful, especially when considering that there are other data showing that probiotics can function as antifungals. So coming back to these gut types, and let me frame these really quick. The gut types can be bacterial, like I alluded to a moment ago. This is from the Rao study. Bacterial, fungal, and also histamine. So let's say you've done the low FODMAP diet, just backtracking for 1 second. You can potentially hit all three of those. The fungal component is a little more yet to be studied, but certainly lowering of histamine levels and bacterial levels have been shown from the low FODMAP diet. Probiotics, same thing. They have been documented, like I mentioned a second ago, to remedy and combat SIBO, fungus, and also to reduce histamine levels. Now, you'd probably expect with all these benefits, there's been documented improvements in leaky gut, improvements in motility, and also looking again at some of Alex Ford's work and also Dr. Quigley, improvements in the gut-brain axis, which can include the limbic system, which governs fear and memory, and even the connection between the limbic system and the adrenal glands via correcting cortisol levels, specifically measured as the cortisol awakening response, which is probably the most accurate way to measure cortisol. When it comes to the formulas, we've discussed this ad nauseum on the podcast in the past. If you take a big picture view, what you see is most probiotics break down into one of three types. Your healthy fungus, Saccharomyces, either boulardii or Saccharomyces cerevisiae, blends as a second type of lactobacillus and bifidobacterium, and soil-based like bacillus species as the third. Different trials have used, in some cases, one species, in some cases, multiple species. But what you see fairly uniformly is different formulas, different doses, different species, different strains are all showing benefit. So at least my take is we don't have to be overly fastidious, and I'll reference our probiotic meta protocol if you want guidelines for those three different formulas, the dose, and the duration. So your first step here is the combination of low FODMAP and probiotics. I would stay on this for 1 or 2 months, and given you feel like it's helping, before reevaluating and considering the next step. Now, that next step is the elemental diet, which, by the way, you could use the elemental diet at any time. I'm just giving you what I think will set you up for the most success. We want to lay some groundwork first with low FODMAP and with probiotics. These have the most research, and they are probably the most curative. However, there's also a strong case to be made for the elemental diet. There's, to date, 2 trials showing benefit with eradication of SIBO and improving symptoms, so really promising. There are droves of studies in inflammatory bowel disease documenting that an elemental diet can reduce autoimmunity and inflammation in the gut. The elemental diet being hypoallergenic, very easy to absorb, and devoid of the prebiotics that we're trying to reduce when we use something like a low FODMAP diet. It's antibacterial, it's anti-inflammatory. The analogy we use, since it's also pre-digested and will absorb within the first couple feet of the small intestine, leaving the remaining 18, 19 feet free to rest, if you will, is like taking time off of a sprained ankle. The one potential sticking point with an elemental diet is if someone does have a fungal overgrowth. Let me explain why. When the elemental diet was formulated, it was formulated to starve bacteria, so it's devoid of fiber and prebiotics that feed bacteria. However, the pre-digested carbohydrates may feed fungus. Now, I say may with some intentionality because there are 2 trials to date, either finding that an elemental diet had no impact on Candida or actually had a slight benefit on Candida. So the jury here is still out, but if you follow the preceding steps of low FODMAP and probiotics, you're going to have your microbiome be in a better place, in my view, to have the optimal response to the elemental diet. Again, all that being said, there are certainly people who we will see at the clinic who found us through our literature on the elemental diet. They tried it on their own. It improved them. In some cases, they'll say, this is the only thing that really moved the needle for me, so I wanted to follow up and get your take. So certainly you can use the elemental diet at any point in time. But I think, again, this is the best sequencing to view this through. So then the final therapy to consider would be herbal antimicrobial therapy. Now, the reason why I leave this item until the last, because, somewhat routinely in integrative functional and natural medicine, the procedure is do a test, invariably either SIBO or dysbiosis on a stool test. So SIBO on a breath test and dysbiosis on a stool test are found, and the clinician says, got to do antimicrobials. That's fine, how I used to do it also. But as we're learning more about the microbiome, we're realizing that the environmental factors that are putting input to your gut can either be inputting it to skew toward imbalance, overgrowth, leaky gut, or putting pressure toward eubiosis, balance. So the more of these healthy input pressures we can set up before the antimicrobials, I think the more likely when we administer that antimicrobial sort of nudge to the microbiota, we will see it re-equilibrate to healthy, to eubiosis, and most importantly, maintain that equilibrium. Oftentimes, the principle and the theory here is before you use antimicrobial or antibiotic therapy, you want to improve host health. So, this is a way of thinking about improving host health before using antimicrobials so that the effect will be as prolongated as possible. In terms of what the research says, it's been demonstrated now in a handful of studies, a small handful, but one in berberine, one by Mullins over at Johns Hopkins, one that we currently have under peer review. These trials have demonstrated that herbal antimicrobial therapy can eradicate SIBO with a similar overall efficacy as rifaximin or Xifaxan. You can use either one, but just to give you the data. And a recent study that I found pretty compelling looked at berberine versus rifaximin. Now, they found similar clearance, but get this. At a 1-month post-treatment follow-up, resolution was more prolongated with the berberine group as compared to the rifaximin. So maybe there's something in the sense that the berberine, the herbs, knowing that they have sort of these pleiotropic or multi-mechanism effects, they're doing more. Maybe they're having an anti-inflammatory and an antifungal effect simultaneously, and this is why there's a prolongation of the results, because the berberine is leading to a healthier sort of total ecosystem perspective. Nevertheless, the data are what they are. It's only one trial, so I don't want to spike the football for the natural compounds just yet. But just to impress upon you, especially if you're someone who's suffering and thinking, oh, I'm apprehensive about an antibiotic, but I've heard so much about the antibiotic, maybe I have to use it. You can use either, but I want to make the case here that the naturals should not be looked at something that are second in terms of the efficacy to the prescriptions. Now, one other caveat I will issue, which is usually the less research there is in a body, the more favorable the therapy looks. And with the more trials and the higher sample size, the initial level of efficacy tends to drop. So who knows? Maybe that's going to happen with the herbals. I can say that in the clinic, we seem to have no problem with the herbals. People tend to prefer them, and there have been a few cases who've come over to us, even from Cedars, working with some of the leading researchers in SIBO, and they weren't really getting much traction. And I think what was happening in these cases is they were only treating the SIBO. They were missing the SIFO fungus because it's not easy to test. When we used herbals, knowing that, again, many of these herbals and probiotics are antibacterial and fungal, they finally had the resolution. The nice thing, again, about some of these herbals is they're also antifungal. And there are interesting efficacy data here also. One study I came across recently that I found fascinating, looking at this New Zealand shrub known as Horopito. It sells under a brand name called Colorex, compared that herb against fluconazole for recurring vaginal yeast, and found that the herb, the Horopito, was more effective. One other thing to be aware of is fungus seems more likely to lead to a die-off. So if you start on a round of herbal antimicrobials and you're saying, boy, the first or the second or the third day, I started having headaches, I was tired, I felt like I had the flu, I had joint pain, then take heed of that for two reasons. One, that could tell you indirectly that fungus is the issue. But the other thing too is that many of these herbal antimicrobials will also kill protozoa and bacteria, as seen in the Lyme family, or more contemporarily described as vector-borne infections or vector-borne microbes. Why this matters is with these populations in particular, there seems to be a trend toward development of resistance. Why this matters is what you don't want to do is only partially treat one of these issues. So in someone who has die-off, I'm much more keen to make sure we do a little bit of a longer course of antimicrobial therapy, even if it's lower dose, because what we don't want to do is treat just until symptomatic resolution and then stop. Because if the symptoms come back 1, 2, 3, 4 months later, then what you might be doing is selecting for a population of bacteria that are becoming progressively resistant to treatment. It's not a hard problem to circumvent, but I don't think this gets enough discussion, which is the more die-off you have, the more attentive you want to be to sort of a treating past symptomatic resolution approach. So I think that's everything I wanted to go through. Again, the tools are a low FODMAP diet, probiotics, a elemental diet, and the herbal antimicrobials. Some people will observe that carbs that are starchy and sugary tend to flare them. That is a flag that you have a fungal overgrowth. So coming back to the gut types, the bacterial, the fungal, or maybe someone who has both bacteria and fungus, be attentive to this, because if you go on a low FODMAP diet, it is possible to do a low FODMAP diet that is high carb. And if you notice you do this and some symptoms improve but some get worse, you might want to do a low FODMAP diet that is lower carb. And I would refer you to our Can Eat a Diet for guidelines on this. This is where I think if you hit a roadblock, a clinician can really help gain some clarity here and disentangle some of the signal from the noise. Also remember that while a lower carb and low FODMAP diet can be a little bit difficult, this is not a forever diet. The analogy we often use in the clinic is if someone injured their back, it would be fairly obvious that the rehab plan they did for 1 or 2 months would not be how they had to live and act forever, but just until the tissues heal, and then they can go back to running, jogging, cycling, weightlifting, whatever they like. There will be one other nuance just to factor in here, just to make sure that I don't underserve the fungal overgrowth type guts that are probably listening to this, maybe about 20% of people, that might be wrapped in along with the SIBO. Again, these are not terribly difficult to disentangle. Taking things one step at a time, taking notes about what helps you and what flares you can help piece some of this together. From a dietary perspective, just to try to state this as clearly as possible, if you notice that starches and sugars and fruits flare you, that's indicative of fungus. If you notice that things like broccoli, cauliflower, salads, fibers flare you, that's more indicative of bacterial overgrowth. It can be both, but also in my experience, there's usually one of these that's more problematic. So it's somewhat rare that someone has to truly do a combination diet, especially if we use probiotics concurrently, because they will help offset both bacterial overgrowth and fungal overgrowth. So if you were someone who had both bacterial and fungal overgrowth, the low FODMAP diet in and of itself, paired with a probiotic, might be sufficient to hit both. So anyway, without going too into the weeds, if this sounds complicated, it's really not. Just take it one step at a time, take good notes, keep the notes big picture and high level, listen to your body, and adjust accordingly. And if you need help, our clinic is always happy to assist you on your path. Okay, this is Dr. Ruscio. Please comment, let me know what you think, and until next time.